some people will look at it, and because it's so new and because it's something that people haven't seen before, it's easy to see those 3D graphics and the beauty of it and say, is this a video game? Is this a sound design tool? People have run into tools where if it looks too nice, it's sort of compensating for something. Maybe it looks really beautiful and there's this visualizer, but does it really make cool sounds?
That's Evan Mezeske, founder of Anukari. Anukari is a unique 3D physics-based synthesizer and effects processor that builds instruments from networks of objects in a real-time interactive 3D simulation. He believes great visuals should make sound design more intuitive, not distract from whether the instrument actually sounds good.
Mick Gordon, the composer and scorer for the Doom Eternal game and a bunch of other stuff, I had no idea he had been lurking on my mailing list. I had zero concept that Mick Gordon was using my software. And he just posted this Instagram and TikTok reel that was unbelievably cool. He made music that I never even predicted you could make with Anukari. People loved the music. They loved that Mick Gordon was out making dubstep stuff when he's normally known for metal. And that definitely got things moving.
In this episode, you'll learn what a 3D physics-based synthesizer is, how Anukari turns virtual physics into playable sound, and how one user can move a new tool further than an entire launch campaign. Stick around, I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is my Inner Circle podcast. It's funny, I looked at Anukari, and at first I cocked my head a little bit, and I thought, okay, what is this? And what is a 3D physics synthesizer? So I know because I played with it a little bit, but for those who haven't, can you explain what it is?
In my mind, Anukari is basically just the software that's trying to allow you to build some physical object that you might conceivably build in real life out of springs and masses and other components. Except instead of having to have a TIG welder and springs and like metal cutting stuff and, whatever, it's letting you build that in this virtual space. And then it's going to try and simulate what that physical system would sound like if you were to actually build it. And there's some things that are not quite close to reality about it. Like, for example, lets you attach things with springs, and those springs can be sort of stiffer than any realistic springs would be. Because, to get a system that vibrates at audio rate and makes sound, you kind of need some very tense springs a lot of the time. So it's not completely realistic in every regard, but it is, in my mind, it's trying to simulate what would happen if you built this physical structure and then banged on it or bowed it or, did whatever kind of thing you did to make it vibrate and get some sound out of it.
Okay, so how did the idea hit you?
I've been interested in video games for a long time. And I'm a software engineer by trade, and I got my start doing software engineering as a kid, building little simple video game engines and stuff. And for whatever reason, the kinds of video game engines that I found really interesting and fun had some kind of physics component to them. And I think that the reason that was always fun to me is that the physics lets you take these very simple, fundamentally very simple equations and stuff and get really interesting behavior from them without having to sort of program all of the weird behaviors. If you simulate a simple physics system, these kind of interesting behaviors can emerge out of it without you necessarily designing them into it. So my background is building all these little physics game engines. And at some point, I was working on one of those physics game engines, and I was like, oh, wow, what if I, simulated this at audio rate instead of 60 frames per second for a video game? What if I just crank that up to 48,000 frames per second? I wonder what will happen. And so I did that, and this is 15 years ago. It wasn't performant. It had to be run offline. It took, minutes to render a few seconds of audio. And it was the simplest thing I could think of, but I mean, after a weekend of work, it made some interesting sounds. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. I don't know what to do with this. At that time, I had a job. But I kind of filed it away as that was one of the really interesting experiments. And so several years ago, when I left the corporate world to go build audio software, that was one of the first things that came to my mind is back then I did this experiment. Seemed really interesting. Seems like it's worth investing some more energy into it to see if there's something interesting there. And, I did that and pretty quickly decided there was something interesting there.
Have you ever noticed that mixing vocals is often the hardest part of getting a track to sound right? You boost, you compress, you add effects, and it still doesn't feel professional. So, to make it easier, I put together a simple mini course on vocal mixing that walks you through the exact steps to get the vocals sounding clear and upfront. If you're interested, scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the show notes. Now, back to today's conversation. It's very cool, I have to say, and I looked at it and I thought, I haven't seen anything really new in the synthesis world for a long, long time. And this is. I mean, it's a completely different approach.
I think so. And it's funny. I mean, in some ways it's really new, and it's not like, I don't want to like take credit for inventing spring mass models, right? That's been around forever. There have been people experimenting with using those for audio since like the 70s. I've had users write in and tell me about this, it's called Gypsy Lab in Grenoble, France in the 70s was doing this kind of stuff. But at that time, obviously doing it in real time with hundreds or thousands of physical components, like computers could not do that. And so I sort of started it at this time where there's an intersection between the ideas being around, but also computers are just super, super incredible. And so it's kind of like applying some of these ideas as like kind of physics, kind of simple physics, like at the lowest level, but applying it with the amazing computational resources that computers have these days, and and then sort of all the stuff that I think is sort of new about it was just figuring out like, okay, so there's a 3D world and there's physics components. Like, how do you build an instrument? Like what and that was all sort of very much an exploration, and I think that's where sort of the new stuff came out, was just trying to figure out how to make a synthesizer like this make sense and be usable in some way.
I said that I looked at it and I thought this is a different approach. And I sent the link out to several of my friends, two which are top sound designers, one for tentpole movies and another one for games. And then a third one who's been a hardware developer for a long time, but he's a long-time synthesis guy. And they all came back and said, this is amazing. I haven't seen anything like this before. And I'm really happy, and I'd like for them to go further with you on this, and sometime, we'll get that happening. But that was validation for me that, okay, what I'm looking at is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, it's been tricky. So the 1.0 version launched a couple weeks ago, and it was in beta for a long time. I've been working on it for more than 3 years now. And one thing, so like now that 1.0 is launched and I'm starting to like really try and work on marketing it, one thing I'm realizing is that in some ways, there's like these beautiful 3D graphics, and they maybe didn't have to be quite so, beautiful. Could have been more utilitarian, but I think they're cool. If I'm going to be looking at it all day, I like these, beautiful clouds and stuff. But a challenge with the marketing is that some people will look at it, and because it's so new and because it's something that people haven't seen before, it's easy to see those 3D graphics and the beauty of it and say, is this a video game? Is this a sound design tool? If it is a sound design tool, sometimes, and people have run into tools where if it looks too nice, it's sort of compensating for something about, maybe it looks really beautiful and there's this visualizer, but does it really make cool sounds? And so it's challenging to communicate like what it's actually doing at its core, and why I think it is a really interesting sound design tool. And some people see the graphics and say, oh, that's the coolest thing, and some people get sort of thrown by them and say, what is this? Like, it's not something I've seen before. I don't know how to relate to this. Maybe it's not for me. It's challenging.
One of the things I found interesting in looking at your site is how well documented the development is. And you have everything down there. I mean, you're much more diligent than I think 99.9% of developers would ever be. But it's a great story, and you told it well. You told, the ups and downs and everything, and you've had ups and downs. So one of the things that I found interesting was your launch, and it didn't go to your expectations at first.
Yes. Yeah. The beta launch last year was, it was interesting. I come from a world of working jobs for like corporations, and generally the launch is sort of like 5 steps removed from me, right? Like I'm involved as an engineering leader in the launch, but like in terms of how it's messaged to the world and how it's put out there, I don't have any experience with that. And for the beta launch, I just sort of did everything myself. I wrote a press release. I don't know how to write press releases, And, some things went well. Like I had a lot of people on the mailing list. I got out to people that way. But yeah, it was, there were aspects of the launch, there's just like weird feedback from people. I think I'm starting to get to the point where I realize that there's always going to be weird feedback. And I'm relaxing into it and being like, okay, the software's not for everybody. Not everybody's going to get it. Some people really want to tell you about how it's not for them. My feeling is that for the beta launch, I wasn't expecting that. And I sort of had these expectations that it was going to go really smoothly, and it didn't. And so, there were a few days in there where I was kind of like, man, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if, I'm getting some negative feedback. I don't know if people are going to like this, but, in the end, it got lots of good feedback, and that helped me sort of like get the perspective that like, yes, there are people who like it. There are people who don't like it. That's normal. And yeah, I think that the last year has been me sort of getting more used to what it's like to be like, developing something in public and doing something that is rather new and unique. And that sort of comes with the fact that like, not everybody's going to get it or like it. And that's fine, as long as some people get it and like it, which I think they do.
But there is one user in particular that really turned the tide, right?
Yes, yeah. So Mick Gordon, the composer and scorer for like the Doom Eternal game and a bunch of other stuff, and just like a well-known metal guitarist, and also a super nice guy. I think it was the second day that the beta was out. I had no idea he had been lurking on my mailing list. I had zero concept that Mick Gordon was using my software. And he just posted this Instagram and TikTok reel that was like unbelievably cool. He made music that I never even predicted you could make with Anukari. People loved the music. They loved that Mick Gordon was out making like kind of dubstep stuff when he's normally known for metal. And people really enjoyed it. And that definitely sort of got things moving. Like I had reached out to certain press outlets that kind of had not really had time to get back to me. And then seeing that, they got back to me. It was also just really good for me because seeing somebody who's obviously like a real musician, really, really, really good at production, understand it and like really get what it's there for, and the ways in which it's limited, and then abusing those into things that make cool sounds. That was just really fun. And, but yeah, definitely got things sort of moving in the public eye.
Let's talk about the Star Trek connection.
Yeah. It's such a funny story. So I have a Discord server, just like, anybody can come join the Discord and chat with me and other people in the community. And before the beta was ready, there was like a sort of alpha period where I had maybe 15 or 20 testers. And I kind of closed down the alpha while I was getting things ramped up for the beta. And somebody came into the Discord and said like, hey, is this out? I want to make Star Trek sounds with it. That'd be cool. And my interpretation of what they meant by I want to make Star Trek sounds was I want to make sci-fi sounds. I want to do sci-fi sound design. And in my head, I was like, oh yeah, it's great for that. And just wait a couple weeks. The beta's coming. It's going to be ready for you. I'm not letting people into the alpha at this point. But then they said something about like Star Trek shows and filming or, like deadlines. And I was like, hey, wait, who are you? And it turned out it was Mike Shapiro, who's like the lead sound designer for all of Star Trek, all the TV shows in the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years. And it was a very confusing and surprising experience. And it turned out he was interested in experimenting with it for the latest Star Trek series that he was working on, which I believe was Starfleet Academy. And he turned into like one of the most fun testers to work with, because he is, if you look at his software setup, it's all the weirdest stuff possible. Like immediately he was using a DAW that I've never heard of, this thing called SoundMiner. And he's just out there, I think there's a reason that he is the guy making sound effects for a sci-fi TV show where you have to invent new sounds. It's because he's out there using the weirdest software, the weirdest tools, the weirdest ideas. And he's provided just an immense amount of super valuable feedback for Anukari.
That's kind of the standard MO, I think, for most sound designers, at least the real pros, where they're not afraid to go into the unknown, and they embrace it more than anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and Mike Shapiro, he's a guy who, I mean, he's out there making his own hardware. You know, he's like, there's no controller that functions how I want. I want to have like this many axes and this, and he'll just build it, you know, and, I think like sound design for film to me is so interesting because, you know, unlike a performance for like sound design, you know, in the sense that you're going to make it and then it's going to go in the show. You don't have to reproduce it. You can kind of do just anything, get the sound you need, and then you're good. And I really find it fascinating that the extent to which you can be very experimental in that, as long as you get a sound that's usable and interesting, and seems like a fun job.
Well, my sound designer friends, when we talk about what they do and they explain it, it's pretty amazing. Like the one I remember was gunshots. So they're recording a gunshot, and he put up something like 15 microphones along the path of where the bullet would go in order to get it all the way. And that was a big part of it. And you know, getting like sounds for a sci-fi movie, and going to the zoo and getting a bear and then pitching it down and stuff like that. It's like, well, who would have thought of that? You know?
Yeah, I was reading some interviews that Mike Shapiro had done with outlets about some of the sound design he had done, and I loved that. Yeah, like he was describing some of the sounds as being layers and layers of weird animal sounds processed in different ways, and things that I never, ever, ever would have guessed had gone into the sound. And then, you know, all these things combined together in a way that just like, to me, makes no sense. But then you hear the sound and it's like undeniably the coolest, most correct sound.
And perfect. Yeah. Perfect for what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing amount of creativity goes into that stuff. Yeah. The 15 microphones thing. I mean, that's so,
Yeah. Well,
that's dedication.
So before going out on your own, you worked at Google.
Yeah, I worked for Google for about 11 years. Predominantly when I was there, I worked on, I spent most of my time working on like stopping fraud and abuse. And I worked in the ads ecosystem. And so the fraud was like things like robots clicking on ads to steal revenue. But also things like I was involved with the systems that decide whether the advertisements or the web pages on which we show the advertisements are like nasty. So for example, like Google does not want to show advertisements on a website that's like hate speech dominated. And also, you know, there's like a lot of things around like, you know, what kind of political ads are acceptable and not acceptable, or ads for certain types of like prohibited stuff. Like Google didn't do firearms and that kind of advertising. So I worked in that space mostly in Google and felt pretty good about it in terms of like the work we did was like protecting users and protecting advertisers from different kinds of fraud and abuse and stuff, but nothing music related. And I've been a musician, amateur musician, since I was a kid, and it's always been just a huge passion for me. And working at Google was really fun, but I'm not a professional musician, and I somehow wanted to tie music into like what I was doing day to day more. And so for me, being a software engineer, being good at that, I'm a much better software engineer than a musician. Coming into the music software industry for me was a way to sort of like integrate music and my passion for music into like more, what I spend all day doing every day. So it's been a very fun change for me. I make less money now.
Yeah. Well, what surprised you about the audio plugin business?
A lot of things surprised me about it. I feel like a lot of them in retrospect are probably pretty obvious, especially to anybody in the industry. But as an engineer, it surprised me just how difficult of a space it is to build. Like building a plugin, you have to support multiple operating systems. On each operating system, you have to support multiple DAWs. You got to be compatible with other plugins. There's effects, there's instruments. The plugin is running under real-time constraints. So it's got to be like very efficient and fast. It's got to be super reliable, because if somebody's performing with this thing and it crashes, that's just a nightmare scenario. And a bunch of other details make it at Google, I built these like huge, large scale, very revenue critical systems. And I thought that was difficult. But the audio software world actually has like this huge set of difficulties. And I'm amazed that there's so many people out there solving them and making like reliable plugins because it's hard. And so I was kind of surprised at how, just how difficult it is to be in the plugin industry as a software engineer. And then, I was surprised by the, maybe less surprised, but realizing the full magnitude of the difficulty from a business perspective in terms of, I would describe the plugin industry as like pretty saturated. There's a lot of plugins. There's a lot of people trying to do this. There's big companies that are building plugins. There's a lot of independent developers building plugins. It's a tricky industry, and it's not like there's a ton of money in plugins. It's certainly a large enough industry to support, developing plugins. But it's not like selling software to hobbyist musicians is, it's not like selling software to corporations. They have a huge checkbook. A musician who does this as a hobby may not have like tons of money to spend on plugins, and they're going to be choosy about like where they actually put their money, and we want to make sure that it's like good software. So yeah, industry wise, I feel like it's difficult on the engineering side and it's difficult on the business side. And yet there's so many people doing it. And I think that that's just a testament to the fact that people love music and want to somehow work in this space.
One of the interesting things about it is there's also a lot of engineers and producers that end up developing their own plugins. They do it because they're looking for something particular that they use all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else can understand that. But that's part of the saturation of the market where, when you have users that are building as well. And this is before vibe coding or anything like that, it was happening. God knows what's happening now with people trying to do that.
Yeah, that's a wild world. But yeah, and I think, producers building their own plugins to me is just like such a cool thing. There's a lot of the software world where, I would never imagine people building their own software, but like I feel like for some reason in the music world, people are willing to go very far to get that thing that they need. And so I find that like really fascinating that is a thing in the music world, and I think it's just the coolest thing. I mean, like bespoke software for specific people for their specific workflow. I think that is a really cool idea about the future. Like more bespoke software, more custom stuff that's like perfectly tailored for your own personal workflow. And if there's a lot of value in the AI for coding world, I think it's that, like making it more accessible to people who are not necessarily engineers by trade to be able to sort of customize their environment in a way that they would not be able to otherwise. But yeah, it's still tricky, still a lot of unanswered questions there.
I don't know if you noticed, but AI is kind of a dirty word. in the music world. There's a lot of pushback on it, even though, something may be just a tool that uses machine learning, for instance. And if you mention AI, wow, the pushback is really, really hard.
It was a quandary for me because as an engineer, it's almost unignorable that AI for writing code is like incredibly valuable. And, as you were saying before, like on my website, I have this developer log where I've written in like a very extreme detail about the development process of Anukari from like, the early stages through the launch. And, I'm on there, like there's almost nothing that I keep secret. I talk about how everything is built, the algorithms, the tools, everything top to bottom. And when I started working on Anukari, AI for code was just not really a thing. I mean, it existed, but I didn't use it. It was semi-helpful. It was, kind of a toy. And over the 3 years that I worked on it, it went from that to being something that is incredibly valuable for writing code. And so, in the last like 6 months, I've picked up using it to write code more. And knowing about the industry, the music industry's view towards AI, I didn't know what to do about that. it's like, should I be using it? Can I talk about using it? Are people going to be turned off by that? And in the end, I realized it's so valuable for making Anukari like just a better product and more usable for people that I could not ignore it. And I realized also, because I've been so transparent in my developer log over the last 3 years, if I somehow didn't even write anything about using AI in my developer log, it would be incredibly disingenuous. Like there'd be this elephant in the room that I'm like pretending I'm not touching it. And so ultimately I decided I have to talk about it a little bit. But I do wonder, like how people will perceive that, whether people will be like bothered. But to me, it's just being open and transparent and honest about how I'm using it is kind of the only option.
The thing that people are most sensitive to is AI replacing them in one way or another, replacing their music, replacing their job. And I'm talking about the music industry for the most part. And I don't see as a tool how that would affect you, except someone saying, well, you're taking a job from another programmer or something. But that doesn't seem to be the problem. Again, it's AI is more competition, AI music, more competition for me now, and that's certainly true. AI artists, again, they're more competition for me. So that's a lot of it, I think. And also, well, gee, it's replacing 4 musicians that I would have hired. So there's a lot of that more than anything. But as far as using it as a tool for something, again, most of the time people understand that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's always going to be the people who are just don't want to touch it or have anything to do with it. And I think that's obviously like a totally okay standpoint, But it's a fascinating thing for me because as an engineer, it's incredibly valuable and useful. And really the person that's putting out of a job is me. Which is just to say I get to spend my time thinking more about like, how should the product behave? Like what features should it have? Instead of like wrestling with the lowest level details of how to build that stuff, which I'm still involved with, obviously, but it goes faster. But then at the same time, even if I hear music on YouTube, for example, and I think like, oh, this is kind of cool. Even if I think it sounds cool, the moment that I realize that it's AI generated, something in my brain just goes, ugh. And I don't know how that feeling is going to evolve over the next 20 years or whatever. But I'm a guitarist. I'm an aspiring jazz guitarist. My favorite thing is to go play jazz live in a combo. To me, the like human performative aspect of music is like such a super important detail, and not just for like acoustic stuff, but electronic music, knowing that somebody decided like where the accent should be on that snare line, and like laid everything out, and just knowing there's like that attention to detail. And that is so important for me to enjoy the music. And so, I totally understand why people feel the way they do with regards to music.
I had someone send me an album's worth of AI generated songs. It's a person that was a lyricist and used it to generate it. And I listened through them all. And, the first time you listen, you go, oh man, it sounds really good. And the more you listen through it, you go, this sort of sounds the same. But it really hit me what the difference was between a human player. And it's the micro adjustments that a human does, the micro adjustments in timing and the fluctuations in pitch, things like that, that are very human. And even though, and we've been doing this for years, we've been, in sequencing, we've been programming that in, it's still never the same because it's so randomized with the human.
I mean, and there's just something about it in terms of like human connection, like those are the traits of the recording that, that make it human and tell you that there is a human on the other side. I mean, one thing I've always thought was kind of funny is, as a jazz guitarist, I think the best feedback I've ever gotten on like solos I played, improvised solos, it's almost always been on solos where I made what I felt like was a mistake. I played like a note that to me was wrong. I meant to hit some note in arpeggio. I played the wrong note. And then you're playing live. And so you come out of it and go somewhere with that. And people come up to me and, oh man, that was a cool solo, man. That part where you did the thing. And I'm like, oh, I thought that was the worst part. I thought I screwed up. But yeah, it's like the mistakes that we make, and just all of the ways in which we're human. I describe myself as a meat popsicle, like a physical thing playing a thing. And that's the human aspect of the performance that I enjoy relating to. And yeah, it's just, even if that is sort of like added in by the AI, it doesn't feel right.
What don't people know about Anukari that you wish they did?
Yeah, this is always an interesting question. I think, so kind of going back to what I was saying about the 3D graphics kind of sometimes throwing people for a loop. I think the main thing that people sometimes sort of can misinterpret is they see these 3D graphics and they think that there's sort of like a veneer on top of things, that they're like there's some kind of audio engine, and then we go from that, and there's this veneer visualizer on top that looks fun. But what I am constantly trying to sort of communicate, and I'm trying to improve the product to communicate this more itself, but really the 3D graphics is in, like, you see these balls and they're connected with springs and other stuff. They are a one-to-one representation of what's happening inside the physics simulation. And so, like I was talking about earlier, it's trying to simulate, if you were to build that thing, like weld together springs and balls and everything, how would it vibrate? And so you're seeing the simulation's interpretation of how it would move and vibrate and fly around and all that kind of stuff. And so I think understanding that is a point at which it really clicks, is that you're like, oh, I'm just manipulating this like physical structure and seeing what it would do, rather than there's some kind of simple abstract underlying model and then there's like a visual component that's sort of related.
Last question, Evan. In your journey, and you've had an interesting journey because you went from corporate to on your own. And most people don't have that kind of experience. So in that journey, what's the best piece of advice that maybe somebody imparted to you, or maybe you learned yourself along the way?
That's a great question. So my mind kind of immediately goes to the process of leaving the corporate world. Because like so the thing about the corporate world, for anybody who hasn't experienced it, it's very comfortable and safe in a lot of ways. There's a paycheck, it's coming, there's benefits, there's, getting fired is actually kind of hard. And so in the corporate world, you can be in this position where, it's very safe. Like, things are predictable, they're going to pay your rent. You could get laid off. That's possible. But so for me, leaving that and coming into, not just sort of like the smaller software world, but also like I'm the founder of a company world, like there's a ton of risk. Like, it's still not even at this point clear whether Anukari is going to be like a super viable business that goes on for a few years or what. I'm still figuring that out. And so, I had some fear associated with leaving that comfort and protection and going off on my own and doing something risky. And, I think the advice that helped me with that was basically, somebody just reminding me, like, you can usually undo these sorts of things. If you leave a job, often you can go back to the job. If you leave the corporate world, it's not like, you have to leave like flipping everybody off and screaming. Like, you can leave nicely and they'll probably bring you back. And I think sort of the more general thing was, often taking a risk, it's possible to do it in a way where the consequences of failure are not as bad as they appear. And for me, it was really easy to see the consequences of failure being like, I have no money, there's no income, there's like nothing works, and I can't get a job, and like, I'm homeless or something. But realistically, like, that's very unlikely. And so I guess the advice is that sometimes these kinds of risks are not actually as risky as they may seem when we're, feeling the worry. And from my perspective, it's been very much rewarding to take the risk and see what happens. And who knows where I'll be a couple years from now. I mean, I hope to be working on Anukari. I could be back at a corporate job. We'll see. But taking the risk has been really valuable for me.
Very cool. Thank you, Evan.
Thanks, Bobby. It's been a pleasure. Really fantastic meeting you, and thanks for all the great questions.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. You can also learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news, and find out about openings for my latest online classes at bobbyowsinski.com. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time